Have you ever been really passionate about a cause or topic? You might be passionate about sports, traveling, family, or animals. This is Mariana. She is a human rights activist. A human rights activist is someone who spreads awareness about a cause they care deeply about. The cause is usually related to a basic right, like the right to an education or access to medical care. Human rights activists can work at an international, national, or local level. A human rights activist at an international level might work for an organization that advocates for women's rights to drive in countries like Saudi Arabia. Did you know that women in Saudi Arabia weren't allowed to drive until 2018? A human rights activist at a local level might work with a community member to make sure there is affordable housing for people to live in. Right now, Mariana is working at a national level. She is focused on issues related to gender equality in the United States. Mariana is passionate about raising awareness about instances where men and women aren't treated the same. Mariana became passionate about women's rights after she took a class in college called the Women's Rights Movement. The women's rights movement first began in the late 1800s when women did not have the right to vote. It wasn't until 1920 and the passage of the 19th Amendment that women received the right to vote. The women's rights movement continued into the 1960s and 70s, where more laws were passed to protect women's rights. For example, in 1964, the Equal Pay Act was passed, which required that women and men receive equal wages at work. This act was monumental, as women were being paid less than men just because of their gender. Can you imagine going to work and making $15 an hour and someone else making $30 an hour just because you're a woman and they're a man? In 1972, another major law was passed. The Educational Amendment Acts included a law called Title IX. This law stated that schools that receive money from the government must treat girls and boys the same. The amendment also gave women equal access to participate in college sports. After Title IX was passed, there were more sports scholarships for women. Before this amendment, there were hardly any scholarships for women's sports at colleges or even any sports teams in general. Even though there was a huge focus on women's rights in the 1900s, human activists like Mariana are still continuing to fight for women's rights today. Right now, Mariana is raising awareness about unequal treatment of men and women in professional U.S. soccer. Recently, the U.S. women's soccer team filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Soccer Federation. The women's soccer team claims that they do not have equal pay compared to the men. The team also claims that they do not have the same working conditions as the men's team. For example, the men's team play in multi-million-dollar stadiums, whereas the women's teams do not get their own stadiums most often. Mariana is creating a social media campaign to raise awareness about the gap between men and women's pay in professional sports. Today, Mariana made a post for Instagram that says, "Women's movement isn't over. Did you know that there are still cases of discrimination against women? The women's soccer team is being discriminated against." Mariana's post went viral. It was shared over 1 million times. Most of the comments on the post were in support of the women's soccer team and stopping discrimination against women. However, some people do not agree with the lawsuit. Members of the U.S. Soccer Federation say that the women's soccer players do not bring in as much money as the men's team. People pay more money to go to men's soccer games, which is why women are paid less overall. As a human rights activist, Mariana knows that not everyone may agree with her views on women's rights. To be an activist means that you take a strong stance on an issue and promote conversations around it. Mariana's goal is to use social media to draw awareness to the pay gap between male and female athletes. Mariana wants to make sure that people know that the women's rights movement is still alive today. Now it's your turn to go on an adventure and be a human rights activist.